All right, welcome back, everybody. Hope you managed to have a good break. We had some interesting discussions about felt like I was in a chill room at a 90s rave with some of the music selection, which was good. It's what I needed to decompress before this next panel. I'm excited where we're going with this one. This is going to be next-gen ID proofing, attacks and protections in AI, oh my. So let me set the stage a little bit. The pandemic accelerated attacks on ID proofing tools, given that so many transactions were forced online and a lot of fraud attempts followed. I think what we're seeing is adversaries are getting more sophisticated against some of the legacy tools we've had, but security practitioners are as well. In many cases, they're using artificial intelligence to more effectively detect and block attacks. Now, AI offers great benefits, but its use has also raised some policy concerns around potential bias and accuracy issues. So this is a panel, and I'll ask everybody to turn on their cameras now and their microphones to come online. We want to try and take a look at a whole bunch of different facets around how AI is being used today, how companies in the space are taking proactive approaches to tackle potential bias and accuracy issues. Also discuss the role policymakers can play in ensuring that these types of tools are delivering maximum benefit and minimum risk. It's a lot of ground to cover over the next 45 minutes, so let's just jump in here. Pleased to welcome the following panelists. First, we've got Brighton Haslett, who's joining us from the House Financial Services Committee minority staff. She's their lead on their AI task force work and also on issues around diversity and equity and inclusion. Welcome, Brighton. Amy Shewart is head of U.S. government affairs for FIDO, a firm in the ID verification space. Dr. Ray Vera is the director of certification programs for the FIDO Alliance. We heard Andrew Shikiar, their executive director, in a keynote earlier today talking about some of the work they do in certification. Ray's the one who makes it all happen. And finally, Jordan Burris is the Senior Director of Product Market Strategy for the public sector at Socure. So let's jump into stuff. Amy, I wanted to ask you to tee things off. We heard a lot in yesterday's sessions focusing on some of the fraud around pandemic assistance, but how easy it's been for some criminals to get past legacy digital ID verification tools. FIDO recently put out a fraud report that detailed just how some of these attacks are getting more sophisticated against remote identity proofing verification solutions. What are some of the takeaways from that report? How are these attacks evolving?
Thanks, Jeremy, for having me today. FIDO, as you know, is a founding member of the Better Identity Coalition and a board member of the FIDO Alliance. So we always look forward to this event each year. As you mentioned, FIDO releases an annual fraud report talking about what we see from our clients over the past year and things we learned. It's not a surprise to anyone that as the pandemic continued, more and more folks are doing things online. And with that, we have some really interesting trends that started to pop up. The average identity fraud rate has really increased by about 44% since 2019. So we know that identity theft and identity fraud are really continuing to be hot topics, as we heard from the Identity Theft Resource Center yesterday. This work is really driven by opportunistic fraudsters that no longer work a 9 to 5. They're working around the clock to stop, to try to steal different types of services. One of the things that's interesting is we're seeing what we categorize more as medium sophistication fraud. So this is fraud that is with less obvious errors. So it could be something as simple as a font that is slightly different. Is it, Arial italicized versus Arial, or some other little small minute change to a document to try to get past systems? The other thing that's really interesting about this is they are also trying to imitate security features. And overall, we're seeing a 55% increase from last year. The other thing that we're seeing in terms of a trend with document fraud and specifically is with our clients, passports are actually the document that we're seeing the most fraud. Our experts believe that that's because the passport is a one-sided document, not a two, and because it's a high assurance document. A passport is going to be the key to get a lot of different services. So if a fraudster can pass our system or another system with a passport, it gives them a lot more access. And so it's something that they're really targeting.
Interesting. Thanks. Appreciate the summary, although frightening to see how some of these things are evolving. Let me ask a follow-up, and I'm going to actually ask both you and Jordan to weigh in here, and I'll let Jordan lead off first. Both of you are in firms that are using artificial intelligence to detect and block these attacks. What can you tell me about how AI is starting to play a role here, and how does it differ from some other technologies that you might use in your security stack?
Thanks, Jeremy, and appreciate being here to talk about this important topic. What I would say is that when you look at the usage of AI, it is really just an enabler for everything that you would like to do within your organization. Far too often when we're talking about security or what is being done to manage fraud, there's a question about how much friction that you choose to introduce for applicants as part of the process overall. And often a lot of the legacy approaches that are taken today try to treat this as a toll gate, if you will. You must pass each gate, you must be perfect. And if you are perfect, you can get through the process. And this creates a whole host of issues as we relates to equity and inclusion, which I know we'll talk more later on in the discussion. But and often as you're hearing this conversation and just that assumption that everyone is bad, it doesn't have to be the case, right? It is possible to manage an inclusive user experience that is seamless and do so in a way that protects security and helps to mitigate fraud. But what it takes is taking a different approach to what has just been done historically. And a lot of this goes into managing around a greater amount of maturity in the way in which we deal with identity transactions, right? For us, identity is dynamic, and the use cases associated with it mean a more measured and risk-based approach is necessary, where you are not going and taking an individual through those phase gates, and instead you're building a holistic view where such that when they run into issues in their environment, say you're talking passports were just being discussed, right? You haven't changed. You just got married and you had to change your name. Well, now you need a new passport issued, or you've recently moved, and as such, information that historically has been on your address has all changed, et cetera. Like these are all gates that in aggregate can lead to a lot of friction for the end user. Now, how do we do that? Like, how do we try to address this? Again, it takes a measure of managing those active and passive signals for an individual user, and such that you can help make probabilistic determinations about changes to their identity profile and the dynamic nature of the identity overall, in order to help get them through the process in a more automated fashion. And just to quickly wrap up with an example, because Jeremy knows I love those when it comes to having these conversations. Let's take a look at Puerto Rico, right? It is not uncommon to have multiple addresses with the same street name, same house number, and the same zip code. Even some rural areas in Puerto Rico don't even have formal addresses for housing units, right? And this is widely available through the Census Bureau. With algorithms and the usage of AI and certain patterns and models that can be pulled together, we're actually able to find better fit for these addresses first, and then work as an ensemble to generalize for all addresses, such that we're better able to identify how these addresses map up to an identity in particular, and then help inform the decision making that ultimately takes place when it comes to granting access to resources.
Thanks. Amy, you can give some examples of how you guys are using AI and machine learning.
Yeah, absolutely. So our biometric checks really have two core elements to them. A, face matching. Does the person, their selfie or their video match the document that they are producing, and are they actually there? So with what we're seeing with fraudsters, spoofing's a real risk here for businesses. And so it's not just 2D masks, it's not just 3D masks these days. It's also, trying to get a video of trying to determine, is that actually Amy on the video chat, or did she record this and anticipate exactly what Jordan was about to say there? Probably not in this situation, but something that we all need to deal with when working on these sort of things. So AI is a huge part of the toolkit here for companies like on FIDO as we're trying to look at these things, because it allows us to scan faces. Everyone, I don't look like my driver's license photo exactly, since it was taken a few years back. And so we have to be able to be sure that my face matches that document, even though I've aged. We also have to be able to tell, are those security features and those slight deviations in a document, are those actually the authentic document, or has it been tampered with? So those are places where we use AI. And I think one of the real challenges as we're having a policy conversation these days about the use of AI technology is that AI can do this in a way that humans just can't always do. We know that humans make mistakes, that there are going to be things that humans cannot spot, but AI can. And so I think fraud prevention is a really great use case for AI, and something that we really encourage the White House to take seriously as part of the Office of Science and Technology Policy's recent RFI.
Thanks. That's a good segue over to Brighton. Let me talk about some of the policy side of things. And I think we've established up front, AI's got a lot of great potential to improve security and other tools used in financial services. But we're also getting concerns from folks who are saying overly automated systems, if we don't understand how they're being designed, who's designing them, what they're going to do and not do, are we putting the machines in charge in a way that's actually going to potentially do harm? And are there some risks there? So how's the House Financial Services Committee been looking at this issue?
Yeah, so we've had several hearings on this issue in a couple of different subcommittees, including your testimony. Actually, in the AI task force, we've had hearings on digital ID as well as the ethics of AI. And then in the diversity and inclusion subcommittee, we've had several hearings on algorithmic bias. And in addition to that, on the Republican side, last April, I believe we released a fintech report covering a broad range of technology issues, but that included a section on algorithmic bias and the use of AI generally. So we're definitely paying close attention to these issues. I think as more and more of our systems throughout the financial sector become automated, that oversight will be really important. One of the key issues that we've looked at is explainability, or the idea that you should be able to explain how an algorithm makes decisions, particularly what inputs you're putting into an algorithm. And at one of our hearings, I thought it was really interesting. Our witness testified that algorithms themselves are not inherently biased or unbiased. They just analyze data, predict future outcomes, but bias can enter the system when developers tell the system which metric to optimize or to focus on most. So I think ideally we can design algorithms that make decisions more accurately and more fairly than those made by humans, but we have to focus on how the algorithms are built. I think the second piece that's really important is testing an algorithm's outputs to make sure that those decisions are both fair and accurate. So the fact that an algorithm contains bias doesn't mean it's broken or can't be fixed or should be abandoned. It just means that we've uncovered a flaw there, and we need to focus on how that flaw happened and how we can fix it so that doesn't happen in the future. So when we find that, I think we can approach those situations with a healthy amount of skepticism and concern, but see it as an opportunity to continue improving AI, learn how the bias got there, and then we can apply those lessons in further applications as well.
Thanks. And let me ask others in the panel to weigh in, Ray or Amy or Jordan, in terms of how are each of you looking at potential bias issues in some of these systems, at least as they apply to ID verification? What are some of the issues at play? How should we be thinking about them?
I mean, so Jeremy, I'm happy to get started from here. What I would say is it's important to look at kind of the overall system itself. And when we're really having a conversation around bias, AI is one element of it, but we have to kind of get to the ground truth and kind of the root, right? If we look at actually just a number of offerings that even exist today, a lot of those based on legacy approaches, they are all driven around, or they have bias incorporated in them, or things that make it harder for folks to engage in transactions, right? If we look at, heavily with identity verification, today, credit data is used as a means and mechanism for helping to identify who someone is. There's over 45 million people, according to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, that are what is called credit invisible, which means that they have barely a credit file. They have no real information associated with that. What does that mean? That these folks will fall into the 20% that get locked out of the system and anything else that goes into it. So if you're building algorithms that make decisions based on credit data, you're effectively introducing what would be that problem or that bias into the apparatus overall. And it's important to recognize that and I think it was lovely put by Brighton, is that when you're building these models, it's important to understand kind of the what's going into the inputs, what's going into processing, what's going into the outputs overall, that we're doing rigorous testing around it. And one way we do it is we look to effectively challenge our models and to do critical analysis around the objectives of each one, confirming that it is still meeting the intent as it was determined. And if there isn't meeting the intent, like what can we change associated with that? And, what can we change within the decision logic ultimately that allows us to get to a better outcome? So inherently, I wouldn't say, AI as it exists is biased. It's more about, being more mature in how we are managing the models themselves. And with that type of understanding and education, it's easier to build on models that can help us solve a number of challenges in the identity space.
So I think this is one of those areas where, FIDO also takes this really seriously and spends a lot of time retraining our models to improve their performance and further reduce bias. FIDO is actually headquartered in the United Kingdom. And so we worked with the UK's Information Commissioner's Office to participate in a regulatory sandbox to see what we could do to further address bias concerns in our model and what are ways and best practices to improve. And one of the things that was really nice about this exercise is it gave our folks an opportunity to really engage with experts, look at what we're doing, try some new things, see if there are ways to make improvements. We had some great results, but it also produced a report that's publicly available. And so that's something that we can share and we can point to as a place that we're really working on this.
Ray, I wanted to pivot over to you because I think that the testing and the certification side of things is something that we want to talk about today. And FIDO Alliance has launched a new initiative looking at testing and certifying products and remote ID proofing. Tell us more about the program and you sort of how it's set up and how it came to be.
Yeah, so time's flying. So it seems like only yesterday we started down the road of identifying what the certification program would look like, or even starting with pure requirements for such a document authenticity type program. But it has been over a year, and it kind of goes back to one of the biggest things that I talk about when, looking at benefits to certification. So why would an organization want to go through certification? And a lot of it goes back to standardization. And that's kind of what I feel like the start was, because there were a lot of vendors out there with these types of products, and there was no real benchmark performance requirements, to meet. So it was more like, organically working together to have these products in the marketplace, and, looking at, FIDO Alliance and, its incredible certification program within the authenticator certification, server certifications, as well as, the upstanding, the biometric certification program. We're very well versed in, identity and access management, identity, authentication, authorization. Just seems real fitting for FIDO to get into this workspace. The program itself has gone through many iterations, working with vendors who are experts in the development of these products and the implementation of these products to define what that baseline performance should look like. And then setting up the policies and procedures around the certification program, and also looking to labs that actually work in this space and do the evaluations on these types of products, and standing them up to be the accredited labs to conduct the evaluation based on the requirements and test procedures as defined by the working group itself. So I think it was interesting, when Amy was talking about like being in the UK, one of the labs that we did accredit is a UK lab, and they have a lot of experience in this. And when I went and trained that lab, we had a lot of conversations about some of the vendors that they had already done evaluations on, just as tests, not against the FIDO requirements, but just in general within this environment, and how much bias actually exists in these products, to the point to where some of the evidence that from their testing was a little bit shocking to the vendor itself. So I think it's really important that we do have a certification program that a vendor can achieve and be able to prove or validate that their products meets these requirements, and rather than coming out with a product that might not meet the benchmark and be labeled as biased. So it's definitely something that you would want to avoid in such a high profile area.
Thanks. And I recall the origins of the program. I mean, one of the things we've seen the last few years has been this explosion of companies that are all saying, oh yeah, we do that too. It almost reminds me of the Star Wars movie Attack of the Clones, where, we're now seeing 50, 60, 70 companies that say, oh yeah, take a picture of your driver's license or passport with a smartphone and take a selfie and we'll match it. And ours is the best. And of course, the one thing that is true, if you have 60 vendors in a room, is they can't all be the best. The performance is going to vary quite a bit. And, at FIDO, it was actually a lot of the members who are buyers of these types of solutions, be them banks or tech providers, health insurers, who I think helped lead the charge with some of the vendors. In fact, FIDO was one who was, there with a couple of its competitors saying, why don't we standardize this testing so that there's actually a good, unbiased, neutral party who can say how this stuff works, rather than just having to deal with, 60 vendors all making the same claims. Where is the program at in terms of, what might we see in the market later this year with certification, since I know it hasn't formally launched yet?
Yeah, so right now we are kind of like in a beta phase for the document authenticity certification program. And the goal is to kind of have a couple beta vendors go through to, test against the procedures and the requirements to see whether or not they can achieve the benchmarks that have been identified. So the performance criteria that's currently identified, and provide feedback to the group. With this, we plan to take all the information back to the working group itself, make any modifications necessary to those requirements. And then the goal is to launch early in, late Q1, early Q2. So we're looking more like a March timeframe for launch of that. And then in addition to that, because that's not the stopping place for the Alliance itself, is that there is also another working group or subgroup within that framework looking at the selfie match requirements. So that is also something that vendors should look forward to and coming out later this year. We still have like policy documents and, what the certification program processes and procedures look like, but the requirements are well underway in their development for that piece of it. And while there are two independent programs, a vendor could come with a complete end-to-end solution and certify under both. So, we're going to make that also an option to anybody in this this space to be able to either go with just the straight document authenticity, or just selfie match, or a combination of both.
Thanks. And whether for Ray or Amy or Jordan or Brighton, would love your take in terms of how testing programs like this can actually sort of help us get to a ground truth on AI enabled solutions, and whether there's a bias issue or whether there isn't, what works and what doesn't. How should government and industry be looking at all of this?
Yep, I'm happy. Go ahead, Brighton.
I was going to say on the testing issue, I think it's important to keep in mind that we're looking for flaws in the system, but you might find a system that's flawed. Like I said, it can be repaired, but even if you find a system that's flawed, it still might be better than a human run system. So when we're doing outcome system testing, we should be measuring against perfect to see if it's a good system, but also measuring against what we're currently using, what's currently available, to see if it's at least a better system than what we have currently. And I don't think we can let, perfect be the enemy of the good. It's going to be an incremental improvement. We're still innovating in this space. So I think that both of those comparisons are important to keep in mind.
Thanks. Jordan.
Yeah, I would say, I agree wholeheartedly with Brighton now. And what I would add is that, and just looking at, the trajectory of secure and, the models that we use today, right? We didn't start off, we have a goal of, being able to perfectly classify 100% of good identities and eliminate fraud as it exists for every applicant and transaction on the internet. But what I would say is that we didn't start there, right? And so these are iterative improvements that get made over time. And I think it's important to really focus then on the outcomes associated with it and being able to address and adjust models as needed in order to seek, optimal performance.
Yeah, and Jeremy, as you mentioned, FIDO was there at the beginning of the conversation with the FIDO Alliance on this, and so feels really strongly that standards and certifications are important to understand what different vendors are able to provide and what the outcomes are. And so we view it as a really important tool for policymakers and for industry users as they're looking at these different new technologies, because as Jordan points out, none of us started where we are. We're building something that's growing, and that technology is constantly changing. And so we need to have a way to be able to understand what it is that it's producing.
Yeah. I wanted to come back to a point Brighton makes. I think it's an important one, which is as you're looking at how well newer systems perform, including those that use AI, what is the threshold we're trying to measure against? And, I thought it was a great point, which is, it may not have to be perfect, but if it's materially better than, the legacy systems it's replacing, that's an improvement. I often, joke, but only half jokingly, we named this group the Better Identity Coalition and not the Solve Every Problem in Identity Coalition, because nobody really knows how to do the latter. But there are some things that industry and government, collaborating together can do to make things materially better. And I think, one of the issues where at least I've been concerned right now is we look at some of these tools, whether it be for ID verification or other places where AI and machine learning are being used in the identity space. There's a concern that it's only going to hurt people. But I think there's ways that we're actually being able to show, measurable improvements, whether it's, better accuracy or in some cases, more auto approvals of applications, which, can lead to more inclusion. And, wondered if, any of you, all of you could all sort of jump in on some of the things you're seeing there.
So kind of piggybacking on what Jordan was talking about, digital identity verification in this space really helps with access. And on FIDO's story starts with a founder whose parents were immigrants and having trouble being able to verify and authenticate. And so I think it's really a great opportunity to be able to help folks with thin credit files be able to access things that they rightfully should be able to access and not being held back because their name changed or they recently moved to this country or for any other reason don't have a credit history that allows them to access services.
I think to add on to there, Secure cares deeply about this issue. We even went forward and put out a white paper related to digital identity inclusion and fairness in particular. And what I can tell you is that, if you're looking at testing for outcomes, from there, we were asked by, we started off in the financial sector. We were asked by banks to perform basically a disparate impact assessment and see, what lift effectively we could generate. I would say if you're looking at outcomes and, how you improve over time for things like, the Generation Z, we were able to get 99% lift, those 62 and older, 16% lift. Male population, 18% lift, female, 21% lift, Asian, 46% lift, and African-American, 28% lift, right? And so there's results out there that empirically showcases how the tools and tactics and techniques that we're using today can allow us to actually get more people through the door ultimately, and therefore helping to, increase what would be that equal access for individuals.
Thanks. And, while I'm an optimist about the technology, I don't want to seem like I'm naive in that there are places where some companies are going to get this wrong. And where, things, I think it was Brighton who mentioned before, in many cases, it's not necessarily the algorithms, but the inputs that are being given, the people who are designing them aren't really thinking about, topics like inclusion and equity. Wonder if I could ask, Jordan and Secure as two vendors in the space, what do you all do on your side, to be proactive, if anything, to try and get ahead of these issues and actually make sure that, there isn't somehow bias, that, even if unintentional, is going to end up, excluding some people?
Yeah, no, absolutely, Jeremy. And look, it's an important question. And what I would say is that unfair bias and the associated friction that it introduces to what would be the underserved populations or those that are younger and high growth digital channels really results in abandonment rates of, I would say, 50% or more. And it basically leads to limiting access for those populations, right? So how do we work through it? And I would say the work for us is ongoing. I work with much smarter individuals, number of data scientists who come from, wide range of backgrounds. And what I would say is that, we focus on, I would say, probably three areas overall. I mean, one is expanding the data that is used to fuel the decisions and models that are developed. Instead of just credit data, which I mentioned earlier, we look to expand to other sources, right? You're looking at education, you look at telecommunication, utility. We're actually connected, and I think previous panels talked about ECBSB and how that is used, right? We're connected with them in particular, and we take that data and we use it in a way to help improve our models and expand our ability to, again, develop what would be, the predictive view of what is a good identity ultimately. The second area we look at is the demographics of potential impact for a particular use case, and then working to prioritize our roadmap such that, we're looking at percentage of transactions where a particular bias may occur. And then we really just take a hard look and focus on solving for that bias in particular, and then optimizing such that it is available for everyone. So I mean, to paint an example of it, right? You look at natural language processing that may be used when you're doing matches of names, et cetera, right? A lot of static edit-based techniques, and don't need to know what that is in particular, but what I would say is it's just a more simplistic view, which allows you to match names. They have a positive bias towards Anglo-Saxon names, averaging 6 characters in length, and a negative bias towards Southeast Asian names, we're averaging 3 to 5 characters in length, and depending on the country of origin, of course. And so, we use various techniques, take token-based, sequence-based, and dynamic edit in order to allow us to improve our models overall and optimizing our ability to recall and do that matching. And then the third area, just to quickly touch on, and I mentioned earlier, is really promoting more of what I would say is that thought leadership or innovation within our teams. Right, 95% of our data scientists that come in are from industries outside of identity and fraud overall. Now, what does that do? That actually gives us diversity of thought and taking nuanced approaches to what would be some of these harder challenges. It's almost, if you're working in a space for a long period of time, it's sometimes harder to think creatively about how you can solve it. And so, a lot of the experts that we have today are able to, just take a different approach to it, and it allows us to, obsessively work towards making those improvements that are needed to our models to increase access for individuals.
So FIDO has always been really focused on making sure that we're addressing bias and believe firmly that identity is the key to access. So, we are always continuing to work on our models, as I mentioned, and the ICO Sandbox was a really important tool for us. But not to repeat a lot of the things Jordan just said, where I think you can find a lot of similarities between our two companies. But we recently just brought on board our first director of diversity, equity, and inclusion at FIDO. And so I think she is going to bring a lot to our company and help us continue to think about this, and has a lot of opportunity, both internal and how our product works, to think differently.
Thanks. Shifting back to Brighton, it's, the start of 2022. It's an election year, so maybe not a lot's happening in Congress, but this is an area where I think the AI task force and the Financial Services Committee seems to have been working on a pretty good bipartisan basis. What sort of policy activity should people be thinking about in the year ahead?
I think the biggest threat in this space is any kind of legislation or regulation born out of misunderstanding and fear. I think when we see a rush to regulate a new technology, it's usually an attempt to mitigate bad outcomes, whether those are real or perceived. So we've seen a couple of pieces of legislation on digital ID, none dealing with bias directly, but Mr. Foster and Mr. Loudermilk have a bill. Mr. McHenry had a bill in the 116th Congress related to Social Security numbers. So I think we'll continue to see regulation in this space. I think the most helpful thing that industry can be doing is to have really frank conversations with policymakers about areas where we should reasonably expect there to be bumps in the road, and demonstrate that industry is taking those concerns seriously and working towards solutions. And there isn't this dire need for imminent overburdensome regulation, which really is what we're doing here today, right? I think with a lot of this in the D&I space, it's kind of a show your homework exercise, for lack of a better word. If you're not achieving your goals, it's a discussion about what you're trying, why that is or is not working, how you're learning from those failures. If you are achieving your goals, what is working? Can you share those successes with competitors in your industry or other industries so that everyone can learn from those? Again, it doesn't have to be perfect, as long as we can show that we're moving in the right direction, that we're improving upon current systems. I think beyond that, we need to have an honest conversation about what sort of oversight or regulation is most effective. It's the whole hammer and nail thing. I think regulatory right sizing is really important in this space. There is a cost benefit analysis here. I think, like I said, the promise of AI is that it can be far better than human decision making. So with that in mind, as we work on improving these systems, we need to balance the benefits of AI tools against the risks and continue to mitigate those risks. But I think we should avoid a rush to regulation that's going to be really burdensome and hamper further innovation and iteration in this space, and could hamper improvements in this space that really can expand access to people who have not traditionally had access to these tools. Beyond regulatory right sizing, I think the final piece is it's important to craft something that will not be obsolete in a few years. I think whenever you're regulating technology, there is an urge to legislate based on what we're seeing in the market right now, but these systems are evolving so quickly that we need to be really careful not to be too technically specific in regulations. so that they don't become outdated in just a couple of years.
Yeah, I think we've certainly seen that before, where you can, point to a technology rather than a principle, and then suddenly the technology changes, and you're, left with a law or regulation on the books that is no longer relevant. I wanted to note, actually, as you were talking about, both, the concerns about policies that might race forward, in an effort to try and prevent harm, but may end up causing more harm. And also talking about Congressman Foster and Loudermilk's bill, which, emerged from some of the work that the Financial Services Committee has done on this issue the last couple of years. When Better Identity Coalition commented about 10 days ago, the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy had a big RFI looking at biometrics and identity verification. And we, broadened it a little bit to say, well, biometrics are one place where AI is being used, but, here's our thoughts on these broader issues. One of our recommendations to them was that the best thing that the government could do to address concerns about, algorithms or analytics run amok that are trying to predict something is to advance the Foster-Loudermilk proposal, because that actually ties into the authoritative sources in the government, where government is the one authoritative issuer of identity that's out there. Being able to bring in, more attribute validation services, like we talked about in yesterday's panel. SSA has stood this up today with the ECBSV system to just give yes, no answers. Is there really a Jordan Burris with a particular date of birth and SSN who's still breathing? That alone, is a determinative factor that can augment some of the predictive tools that are out there to get better outcomes. And so we're, looking forward to more discussion with OSTP and other policymakers on that front. We've got just a couple minutes left. I see we have a question in the queue from Christian Bear, who said, last year, the General Services Administration released the Digital Worker Identity Playbook to help agencies determine the risk of digital worker identity management. I think this was tied to remote workers in the government. Was curious if anyone on the panel has seen this playbook being used in the ID proofing space.
So given at that time I was working in government, I would say that I haven't seen it be used largely towards the identity proofing space. I would tell you that, a lot of focus right now has been, or leading up into this moment in time, has been on, tracking, if you will, entities and how they operate within an environment, how you're looking at authentication events and things like that overall. And what I'll tell you is that, while authentication has gotten better, and you've heard all the ways in which FIDO and others are working on that, identity verification has just gotten harder, right? And we're seeing increases in folks not being able to get through the system, to get through the funnel. We're seeing increases in fraud overall. And so I definitely, looking at that particular issue, I would say it was probably a little more nuanced and dealt more with the life cycle, if you will, of an entity. But there's definitely opportunity for the government to really take a hard look at what is being done for identity verification. We know that NIST is looking at, updating would be 863 publication. I definitely think there's tons of improvements that could be made overall to just help advance the ball in this space.
Thanks. Any other perspectives on that question? One thing Ray, I wanted to come back to you a little bit to talk about, you mentioned, FIDO's rolling out the certification program. It'll focus first on the document authentication side, and then the selfie match component will come in later. Knowing that the document authentication side, you might see in a couple months, the ability to start piloting that certification program. Can you go into a little bit more detail about what are the things that the labs will be testing for when, different vendors, perhaps Socure and FIDO, and others come through to, test how those solutions work?
Yeah. So I first want to go back to a comment that was, or, conversation that was being had before, is like, coming out with products, they might not be perfect to start. There might, in the certification program, we've identified a baseline. Like, this is the benchmark performance criteria for the certification. And when we launched the biometric certification program, we kind of had a baseline there as well. And what we realized is that while some vendors were able to achieve it, a lot weren't. And it kind of like manifested in this way that right now we just went through a major change in that criteria. And, at first it was like 20%, and now we're looking at 7 and 15%, on the different types of, performances, specific to, pad testing. So there was considerable change, within the marketplace. And I imagine the same thing will happen with this program as well once we launch it and kind of get vendors through the certification. Specifically, it's broken down into 2 sections. So there is a document verification piece of it. So you're looking at fraudulent documents and real documents like authentic, I was trying to think of a word, the authentic documents. And so there's different tests for that, the document reject rate, false reject rate, false accept rate, and things like that. The second aspect of it is the physical documentation. So actually having individuals physically come to the location to test the device with a physical document. So then there's also, just accept rates and reject rates defined within the program for that. So those are the 2 main areas in which this program does the evaluation for document authenticity verification.
Thanks. Another question from the audience, Ann Walwork asked, is industry working with NIST to update its digital identity guidelines, special publication 800-63, on testing to, I think to paraphrase it, to reflect the tons of improvements that can be delivered on identity verification that Jordan just mentioned? Is there an opportunity for public-private partnerships or closer collaboration on testing and standards development?
Yeah, I mean, so I guess to start off, and always great hearing from you, Ann. We are absolutely looking to partner with government to solve this challenge. I would say that when Secure launched its public sector business last year, it was the intent of helping government work these challenges in particular. I've seen firsthand from my time working in the White House how the work that's being done in identity, albeit great, right, can leave a number of folks out of the process overall. And so as we have more things moving online and remote, we're looking to maximize opportunity. So I would say absolutely, we're looking to provide commentary, do roadshows, educational campaigns, if you will, to have more robust discussion on this topic and really, again, get us to a better place of maturity.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that industry is happy to always engage and give feedback and suggestions to the government and work as a partner here. I think that's something that really the Better Identity Coalition has done so well, particularly when you think about eCBSV and the partnership with SSA to move that forward. This is another area where I think that industry can really be useful.
Thanks. We've just got another minute left or so. I think we'll take a break after this before our next spotlight session with FinCEN and FDIC. Any closing thoughts from panelists before we wrap? What's the one thing we should have asked you today that we didn't get to ask you? All right, I guess we were completely thorough, covered everything we had to talk about in this. So you'll remember it as soon as we click off what it should have been. Thank you, Amy, Jordan, Ray, Brighton, really great discussion. We're going to take about a 3-minute break, and then we'll come back at 1:45 Eastern with Kay Turner and Sultan Megji to talk about the new FDIC FinCEN tech sprint in this space, how to measure the effectiveness of digital identity proofing services. So we'll be back in just a couple minutes. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.